Welcome to A Conversation with History. I'm Harry Chrysler of the Institute of International Studies. Our guest today is Niall Ferguson, who holds the John Herzog Chair in Financial History at New York University, is Senior Research Fellow of Jesus College at Oxford University, and is a visiting fellow this fall at the Hoover Institution, Stanford University. He's the author most recently of Empire, The Rise and Demise of the British World Order, and the Lessons for Global Power. Niall, welcome to Berkeley.
It's nice to be here.
Where were you born and raised?
I was born in Glasgow in 1964. The 60s didn't happen in Glasgow, so I was raised in a previous era. I think it may have been the 19th century, actually. The west of Scotland bourgeoisie was firmly rooted in a now vanished world.
And looking back, how did your parents shape your thinking about the world?
Well, my parents are both scientists in the sense that my father's a doctor, my mother's a physicist, so I'm a great disappointment to them.
A humanist,
yeah, I'm the black sheep of the family. Although my mother's father was a journalist, and therefore writing for a living was seen as a perfectly respectable thing in the family, which wasn't true necessarily throughout West of Scotland society.
And what got you interested in history?
Tolstoy.
Why Tolstoy and how?
Well, most people who read War and Peace don't read the coda at the end, the essay on determinism. I found it actually by far the most enthralling part of the book when I was a schoolboy. I can remember feeling rather ill and taking a day off school, which I did rather regularly in order to pursue my own autonomous study, and reading War and Peace in the garden, because occasionally the sun does shine in Scotland. I got to the end in a state of great excitement, having had the meaning of life largely resolved through the experience of Pierre, the central character, and then came across this extraordinary essay on determinism and contingency in history, and it absolutely electrified me. And from then on, I think it was fairly clear that it would be history rather than English literature that I studied.
And you have a real passion for history. Is that a fair statement? I mean, you live it and breathe it?
Yes, I think it's a kind of condition, almost a medical condition, to be obsessed with the past, because the activity of history is essentially an engagement with the dead. And to be absolutely precise, a lot of historical research takes the form of reading letters written by dead people. And to spend the best years of your life sitting in archives or libraries reading dead people's letters is really rather an odd condition. But luckily, it's not regarded as certifiable, so we're allowed to wander the streets and even to teach in academic institutions, where in another culture we might very well be under some kind of heavy sedation.
Now, I noticed that your background comes up in either footnotes or introductions to some of your histories. At the beginning, I think, of the book on war, you talk about your grandfather and his experiences. And then in the Empire book, I noticed there's a whole section on the Scots as soldiers and administrators of the empire. Talk a little about that. That must be really satisfying to elucidate both your family background and Scotland's.
Well, it might seem terribly self-indulgent to begin books by talking a little bit about one's own family. I mean, I talk about my grandfather's experience in the First World War right at the beginning of the Pity of War, and describe his experience as a teenager joining up right at the beginning of the war, actually underage. And at the beginning of Empire, I talked about the experience of my great aunt Agnes, who emigrated in 1911 to Canada. Now, was this self-indulgence? The answer is not really. It's a way, it's a device to introduce readers to big subjects, but through a kind of human portal, if you like. I think it's much easier to ease somebody into what is actually quite a difficult argument about the First World War by saying right away, up front, history is about people, it's about individuals, and it seems to me impossible to understand the historian's motivation if one doesn't understand his own, as it were, ancestral connections with the subject. And I certainly would never have written a book about the First World War had it not been for my grandfather and also all the things his generation left behind in Glasgow, including war memorials that I saw every day at school. These were the things that really inspired my youthful interest in the past. And I think if it encourages readers to pick up a book, if they can see at the beginning something to which they can relate, because after all, a great many readers of that book had grandfathers or great-grandfathers with some kind of wartime experience, then good. That's a good device to use.
Now, what does it take to do your kind of history? Because you have a remarkable breadth to your work. When you're talking about war, it's not just diplomatic and military history. You're also talking about the economy, and society. So what is involved in preparing for that kind of work and that view of history?
Well, you could argue this is slightly dilettantish, and in an age of professional specialization, I'm rather promiscuous in that I dabble in economic history and then flirt with military history and then hang out for a little bit with the diplomatic history and even do some cultural history. And I'm sure some people in the academic world would regard this as very unsound. To my mind, those specializations, those compartments that we've erected in academic institutions are in fact a barrier to understanding, because it's the connections between for example, economic and military history that are really interesting. And all the work that I've done from the very first book I ever wrote has been about, if you want to put it this way, the interface between economics and wider social and political questions. It's just that interests me. And if one were simply to say, Neil Ferguson does financial history and his books were exclusively about financial transactions and had no relationship, for example, to 19th century literature or to the great military conflicts of the 20th century, well, they would be, more boring books, but they would also be far less illuminating, I think.
Mm-hmm. And so really this strategy works toward giving a big picture of what you're discussing, or a different cut into the problem?
Well, I think there are some very profound problems of causation in modern historiography that are rather underexplored. There used to be a straightforward causal model, which was more or less on the shelf to be used by students and professors alike, and it was called Marxism. And in Marxism, it was the economics and the economic change that essentially drove everything else. Now, that's long gone, but in its place are a whole range of far less clearly articulated and intelligible models, and indeed there are some models which don't really have any room at all for the economics. I mean, a great deal of the cultural history that's done today seems to me almost completely divorced from economic reality, and that's just, seems to me, pretty futile, because certainly the study of modern history is simply inseparable from the study of economic history. And my mission is really to join the dots together again and to say, look, history is a holistic undertaking. We simply cannot exist in little boxes talking to mutually interested specialists if we want to have some understanding of the way in which, to give one single example, financial markets interact with grand strategy. It's an issue which really is at the center of global politics today, and it was at the center of global politics 100 years ago. But you can't understand it if there's one group of people studying the financial markets and one group of people studying the wars, and they never meet.
Mm-hmm. Now, you are associated with a way of thinking about history that has another dimension to it, and it's called counterfactual history. Tell us what that is and how it adds another layer, another dimension to this holistic view.
Well, counterfactual history is a mouthful and a rather off-putting one, and some people might find it a more accessible idea if one said it is to do with what-if questions. Mm-hmm. What if the United States had never intervened in the First World War, or indeed in the Second World War, just to take a single example. Those kinds of questions used to be regarded as frivolous and unserious by professional historians. The great E.H. Carr, in his dreadful polemic, What is History?, dismissed them as the kinds of questions that would be asked by bad losers. And in fact, it's a really very frivolous argument to make against counterfactual history, because in my view, it is impossible to understand any major historical event without posing a what-if question, either implicitly, which many historians do, or, and I think this is much better, explicitly. For example, if you think the Great Depression was the reason for the rise of Hitler, then you are implicitly suggesting that if there had been no Great Depression, then there would have been no Nazi regime. Now that's the kind of implicit counterfactual that I argue in a book called Virtual History should be explicit. We should be straight with our students and with our readers and say, as I tried to do in The Pity of War, I think if Britain had stayed out of the First World War in 1914, a perfectly plausible scenario, since it was a keenly, hotly debated question in the British government, the world would be very different. The entire 20th century would have turned out differently. And I think it's, in a sense, a matter of scholarly responsibility to say that explicitly and then to try to show the reader what an alternative history would have looked like.
And what is involved here, I guess you're saying, is that you actually have to look at the alternatives that were presented to the actors for which there is evidence, and which might have pointed to a different course for history.
I think that's the key. It's not a matter of plucking imaginary scenarios out of the air. Virtual history, and this is a very, very important point, which isn't understood by many people who dabble in what-if questions, is only legitimate if one can show that the alternative you're discussing, the what-if scenario you're discussing, was one that contemporaries seriously contemplated. And in all the essays in the book Virtual History, the contributors were asked to make it absolutely clear what the evidence was for their alternative scenarios. And after all, that's not difficult to do, because in the present we don't know the future. We have plausible futures from which to choose. We make plans, we build scenarios. We do this in our everyday lives because we have absolutely no idea what's coming a year from now. So it's not difficult to go back and find that in 1914, just to give that example again, British politicians were imagining plausible scenarios, including non-intervention. That's how they made the decision. They set these scenarios out, they discussed them, and they opted for intervention because they saw a nightmare future of German domination of the continent. That's the key point. You've got to look at the alternatives contemporaries considered. And after all, if we are in the business, as Ranke said we should be, of capturing the past, wie es eigentlich gewesen, as it actually or essentially was, that has to include the experience of decision-making, the experience of contemplating futures, including futures that never actually happened.
And it also leads to a critique of earlier decisions, because I believe in the World War I book you suggest that had the Brits spent more money on armaments, they might have deterred the Germans, which they didn't do, and then they wound up intervening at a time when it was too late because they didn't have enough armaments.
Yes, I think the next step that one can take with the counterfactual method is to make assessments, judgments about past decision-making. And this is, it seems to me, an extremely important part of the historian's responsibility. It's not obligatory, but Meinecke said that history was about causality and about values. It was about evaluation. It was about judgment. It wasn't simply about, so to speak, presenting the pasts and simply leaving the reader to choose. To my mind, once you've shown why a decision was taken and what the alternative scenarios were, it seems perfectly impossible to resist the temptation, at least I find it impossible to resist, to say, well, actually, maybe they chose the wrong one.
And when you make that kind of argument, you're subject to a lot of controversy, I guess, in the field, because you're really going against the conventional wisdom of the meaning of the British intervention in World War I.
Well, in that specific case, it was certainly controversial because people, generally speaking, like to live with the past that happened, and they're quite troubled when they're presented with the idea that there were, as it were, parallel universes in which that past didn't happen. Now, in the world of science, this notion is perfectly well understood, and incidentally also in the world of the law, where but-for arguments, what-if arguments, are indeed a routine part of arguments about responsibility and causation. For some strange reason, the historical profession walks away from this kind of reasoning, I suspect because some people find it rather difficult, and therefore when one comes along and says, well, in fact, there were alternatives in 1914, here is the documentary evidence that the cabinet was not just divided, but in fact fact that a majority of the cabinet favoured non-intervention, and here are the consequences. Britain doesn't go in, the Germans win a limited continental war, and the consequences for the rest of 20th century history are not only different, but preferable. And this was the thing that I think many readers, including many readers in Germany, incidentally, German academics absolutely hated the book, found quite difficult to imagine.
Because
they had a sort of pre-programmed notion that any kind of German victory in a 20th century conflict would be the worst possible outcome. And one obvious implication of the book was that Germany in 1914 was a far less malevolent Germany than the Germany of 1939, which I firmly believe to be true. I mean, a German victory in a limited continental war against France and Russia in 1915 or 1916 would have had really quite benign consequences, not least, and this is a point often misunderstood, for the Jews of Eastern Europe, who would have been much better off under the Wilhelmine Imperial Reich than they were under Tsarist Russian rule.
And I think you suggest that Hitler might have continued painting in Vienna.
Well, Hitler would have been out of a job, to put it mildly, because there's simply no way to imagine a Nazi regime emerging, or indeed a Weimar Republic emerging, if the Kaiserreich, if the Imperial Reich is victorious in the war that it begins in 1914. That regime would have then endured. And actually, I think, interestingly, it might well have endured and liberalized, because one of the interesting consequences, as contemporaries pointed out, of the decision for war in 1914 was that the Social Democrats were brought into government for the first time. So the Kaiser's wartime government initially moved to the left, and many German conservatives rather worried that one consequence of the war would be a shift in the direction of constitutional concessions to the working class as the price for their collaboration in the war effort.
So what the history that you're describing in the particular example seems to require kind of a comprehensive set of knowledge, and by comprehensive set of knowledges I mean coming at the problem from different fields, basically. You know, what economics tells us about Germany at that time, what diplomatic history tells us about Germany at that time, or Britain on the one hand. So that a lot of different kinds of knowledge brought together in a new way, which then suggests what's at work here is really historical imagination of a different kind.
I think there are, in a way, two stages to the work that I do generally. What stage one is to try to understand what contemporaries thought was happening. Understanding contemporary thought is the first thing the historian should be concerned with. And in that respect, I'm a kind of classical historicist. I think what we're about is trying to recapture past thought and past experience with all its uncertainties. And so once one's actually entered, if you like, the mind of past actors, you're halfway there. You can see what their options were. You can assess the decisions that they made. But part two of the process is then to say, well, with the knowledge that we have, subsequent knowledge garnered from economic and social and other research, we can perhaps see better than they could see which of the decisions was to be preferred. And I think juxtaposing contemporary perception with what I would put very crudely as economic or strategic reality is really quite a satisfying way of interrogating historical problems. It's, of course, a little simplistic to say, here are the perceptions and here is the reality. One always wants to avoid the condescension of this story into the past. What we know with the benefit of hindsight is knowledge that has to be very strictly separated from what we know contemporaries knew when we're assessing their decisions. There's no point saying they got it wrong because they didn't know, for example, that the German economy was about to outstrip Russian economic growth in the 20th century. How could they possibly have known that? If you're going to make a value judgment, you can only judge them on the basis of what they knew at the time. But I think there's a second order judgment you can make, which is the judgment with the benefit of hindsight. As long as you make it clear that's what you're doing, that seems to me perfectly legitimate.
Now, much of your work has been about what you call the nexus of money and power, and your book is called that, actually. I can show the book. Tell us about what drew you to that set of problems. Was it a particular mentor that you had, or it didn't all come from Tolstoy, I assume?
Well, Tolstoy has relatively little to say about financial history. Yeah. It's true. I think from a fairly early stage in my undergraduate career at Oxford, I became interested in economic questions, more interested than my tutors, who were rather horrified when I said I'd rather read Adam Smith than Hobbes. This was a great turning point in my Oxford career. I think it was regarded as distinctly revolutionary from then on. But from my point of view, as somebody who was fundamentally interested in the modern period, it was far more important to understand Adam Smith than to understand Hobbes, and far more important to read Keynes than to read Marx, who manifestly had no idea about economics, though he had some quite interesting German philosophical insights. So I spent some of my undergraduate career almost teaching myself economics and economic history on the side. The traditional Oxford history course didn't have terribly much of that sort of thing. And I wonder if that was partly a function of my Glaswegian background. I mentioned earlier that I sprang from the Glasgow bourgeoisie. I remember being given Adam Smith as a present by my father on one occasion, with an obvious implication that it really was time I started thinking about the cash nexus. And Scots, generally speaking, are more prepared to talk about money than the English. Thomas Carlyle, the great mid-19th century historian, a Scotsman himself, was the man who coined the phrase, the cash nexus. And the interesting thing was that Carlyle argued against many 19th century materialist philosophers that money wasn't everything, that money wasn't really the driving force in political change. So when I use the words the cash nexus, it's partly in order to capture Carlyle's idea. This is important. The relationship between politics and economics, between power and finance, is very, very important. But we shouldn't assume that it's a one-way street in which economic development determines political outcomes. The central argument of the cash nexus as a book was that quite often the direction is in the opposite way, and that it's actually political crises, political events, and particularly wars that shape economic and financial development.
And what that book really becomes is a statement about the kinds of institutions that were created by the state as part of the state-building process.
Or even as part of the war-making process,
which had broader implications for the economy. And you have a square of power, or a power square. Tell us what that is, and what actually you wound up concluding.
Well, this came about because I was trying to persuade my wife, a very skeptical woman, that the argument of the book was worth making. And on the back of a paper serviette in Venice, where we were celebrating our wedding anniversary, I sketched what I thought was the essence of the argument of the book. And I drew a square and I said, look, there are four institutions that come about almost inadvertently as a result of war making and the exigencies of war finance. And these institutions are a tax collecting bureaucracy, a representative assembly, a central bank, and some kind of financial markets in which the national debt can be financed. These are the institutions that arise. They arise primarily out of the exigencies of military conflict. But when they come together, first in Holland and then spectacularly in England in the 17th and 18th centuries, they turn out to be the magic key that unlocks economic development. It's not intentional. It's not supposed to bring about the Industrial Revolution. But once you get this combination of non-corrupt tax collectors, of representative assemblies in which property owners actually have a say about the tax rates that they pay, once you get a central bank in which the money in an economy is managed in a rational way without the kind of multiplicities of coins or worthless pieces of paper in other systems, and finally, once you get financial markets where governments can borrow really quite large sums of money at low interest rates, then you're off. There are all kinds of what economists call externalities. That's to say, unexpected side benefits that propel economic development in the private sector. That was the crux of the argument. And I know little diagrams with squares and triangles often look like the worst kind of political science. But look, it convinced my wife, so how can you argue with that?
That's right. It was done on a napkin, you said?
It was indeed.
Yeah, well, that's how we make economic policy. So,
with many of the greatest decisions in history have been done on the back of paper napkins.
That's right. So in a way, what you, in this power grid, whatever you call it, power square, you're establishing the basis for not only the building of the state, but the criteria by which you can anticipate which states will become more powerful than others.
Right. There's actually quite a wide range of different combinations in the modern period as states adopt or choose not to adopt this combination of institutions. Some, for example, don't get adopted at all or get adopted very late. You could have a system in which one corner of the square is missing. Mm-hmm. Now, the interesting thing about the United States is that it didn't have a proper central bank until the eve of the First World War. It muddled through the 19th century with only periodic central banking functions being performed by the First and Second Bank of the United States. And in the later 19th century, before the creation of the Federal Reserve System, there was actually a tremendous chaos in the monetary institutions of the US, giving rise to quite severe financial crises. So what's interesting about the square of power, as I call it, is that you can have three of the institutions and be missing a fourth, and that can have quite important consequences for economic development. It's not, in a sense, an equation, it's just a representation that allows us to see which institutions matter. And what I was really trying to do was to say, in the most recent economic work on institutions, it's been very clear that institutions matter and markets don't operate without the right institutional framework. So this wasn't a novel insight. I was really just applying it to the past and then saying, this helps us do things with social history too, because instead of thinking in terms of classes, which traditionally historians did, following a long tradition going back to Ricardo, not just to Marx, instead of thinking about classes, we could think about particular functions associated with these different institutions. And that gave rise to another concept, which is central to the book's argument, that there are circles of influence, and they're not classes, but they're separate, if you like, functions. Taxpayer, voter, borrower, bondholder, and these functions overlap. Individuals can be all three of these things, or all four of these things, or they can be only one of these things. And I find that far, far more illuminating than traditional class analysis.
Mm-hmm. Now, how does a theory, if that's what this is, like this emerge from somebody who is a historian? I mean, how do you come upon this set of ideas? How do they come to you, so to speak?
Well, dissatisfaction with what I'm reading, I suppose, would be part one. Part two, I think, and this is important to emphasize, is that in teaching, and I've spent, 15 years giving tutorials to Oxford and Cambridge undergraduates, you very often have your own rather complacent views challenged by bright students. So first dissatisfaction with the existing literature, then some slap in the face from a bright 19-year-old, followed by a kind of back-of-envelope attempt to come up with something better. I suppose more than many historians, I am drawn irresistibly to theorize, but I'm a historian because I suppose I do some serious digging without particularly strong preconceptions before I come up with a theoretical model. Whereas, of course, the conventional mode in the social sciences is to first design the model and then find the data. I had a very funny discussion when I spent a year at the Bank of England, and it was a very illuminating year, and I wanted to learn some more financial economics. And I had a little theory which I had been working on about the way the financial markets had worked in the 19th century. And I talked to somebody who was very expert in the modern bond market, working at the Bank of England. But she was a trained economist. So I said, well, here's the stuff I've been gathering, and I'm wondering what you think of this. And she said, very worried. She said, well, before I can look at the stuff, I would first have to construct a model. And I said, well, don't you think it would be better to look at the evidence first and then draw up the model? That's a very profound methodological difference. It was something that Ranke understood in the 19th century that made history different, that we sort of mess around with a lot of rather random data before we hesitantly formulate a hypothesis. And that's, I actually think, much healthier.
Mm-hmm. Now, the other element in your work that really stands out, and there's obviously a nice transition when you talk about state building, is your sense of the globe, of the world, of different places where these phenomena are happening, and then how, in the case of state power, one state does it all right, everything comes together, and suddenly they're all over the globe. Hence your work on the British Empire. And before we talk about that, how do you explain that intellectual leap, from the focus, on the state to a global perspective? And this is your new book on empire.
Well, I think the answer is that once I had begun to think in terms of political structures and financial institutions, it hit me that the world was not, in fact, made up of nice, neat, discrete nation states. A lot of 19th century history textbooks tended to argue that it was, but when I was writing a history of the Rothschild Bank, which was in some ways the biggest scholarly undertaking of my career to date, which involved 5 years in the archives of the biggest financial institution of the 19th century, it suddenly hit me that the 19th century world wasn't like that at all, that there were actually relatively few nation states in the classical sense, and the world was far more shaped by empires and their satellites, colonies and dependents. And so writing the history of Rothschilds brought me right up against the simple truth that the later 19th century particularly was an age of globalization dominated by a supranational entity called the British Empire. Now, once I had hit that subject, it was really one of those epiphanies. I suddenly thought, I've been teaching 19th century history, British and European history, and I've completely missed the most important thing about this period. That is that a quarter of the world is under some form of British rule or other. And the areas outside that area of formal empire are also pretty clearly under British influence. So after that insight came, once I had, in a sense, come up with a theory of 19th century globalization that said, actually, it's Anglo-globalization, well, I really had to go off and do some work on the British Empire face-to-face directly.
Mm-hmm. And before we talk about that, tell us a little about the Rothschilds. What emerged from that study, that enormous tome, that surprised you, if anything? Was there something that was really a discovery for you?
Oh, it was a huge discovery, a revelation. Mm-hmm. There were two parts to it. The first was the sheer scale of this institution. It was vastly bigger in terms of its assets and its operational extent than most states. This was an institution which you could only imagine existing today if tomorrow in the Wall Street Journal you read that Goldman Sachs and Merrill Lynch and Citigroup were merging with the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. Mm-hmm. That was the scale that the Rothschild Bank's operations represented a century ago. So the scale of it just blew me away. The second part of the realization was just how financial power operated through this extraordinary and rather intimidating thing called the bond market. Because what the Rothschilds did was they traded government debt. They issued government debt and they traded it. And if a government went into financial difficulties, needed to raise a loan, which was usually to fight a war in the 19th century, it was quite hard for them to avoid dealing with the Rothschilds. So I suddenly realized that a lot of 19th century history, the classical diplomatic history that I had been raised on, reading A.J.P. Taylor as a student, was missing a key actor. It was almost completely invisible from the scene if you looked through the diplomatic documents. But if you looked through the archives of the Rothschild Bank, you discovered that the likes of Bismarck or Metternich, these great, towering political figures, were at times in their careers entirely in hoc to this financial institution, really very, very dependent on its financial power indeed. So this was a real revelation. And I do think actually that 19th century historians haven't yet fully taken on board the magnitude of the Rothschild contribution, partly because there's still this professional sense that that's business history. Ferguson wrote the history of a bank, very good, very nice, but it's really got nothing to do with us. We do political history. Sorry folks, political history in the 19th century was completely inseparable from from the way in which the bond market worked, because all these governments had really narrow tax bases. If they wanted to go to war, if Bismarck wanted to unify Germany, he had to do it with the connivance of the bond market. Otherwise, he simply didn't have the resources.
And did that suggest that the arrows flowed the other way, from money to power, or is it just rather that power really had to negotiate with the Rothschilds?
It was fascinating to see the way in which the arrows went in both directions. Of course, there was a great 19th century and often anti-Semitic myth that said the Rothschilds ruled the world. American populists believed it at the time that the US went onto the gold standard. So part of my objective was to see just how true that was, just how powerful this institution was. And the answer to the question was, it was powerful, but there were limits to its power. There were moments when a political decision could trump the power of the financial markets, when in fact, by inducing a financial crisis, an event like, say, the 1848 revolution could very nearly wipe the Rothschilds out. So for me, the really satisfying thing about this study was to see that financial power really mattered, but it wasn't as enormous, as absolute as its critics often alleged.
So I interrupted you when you were on the road to empire. So what are the lessons, if that isn't too presumptuous a question to ask someone like you? What are the lessons that you learned about the British Empire in your study?
Well, it's not presumptuous because the word lessons, of course, appears in the subtitle of the American edition. I should say that the lessons for global power was a subtitle I wasn't entirely comfortable with. The subtitle of the British edition of the book is How Britain Made the Modern World. But strangely enough, an American publisher felt this wasn't the ideal subtitle for the US edition. So there are explicit lessons, and I draw them out in the conclusion to the book. One of the key arguments, and it's tremendously topical today, is whether an Anglophone imperial power engaged in what we now call nation building, but which 100 years ago was called empire, can successfully transform the institutions of failed states or rogue regimes and lay the foundations for the things that both British and American empires believe in, namely free markets, the rule of law, non-corrupt administration, and ultimately representative government. And the lesson of the British imperial experience is that this can indeed be achieved, but that it takes really quite a long time for this to happen. Occupations of such states, and there were a great many, particularly in the second half of the 19th century, when I would say the British Empire entered its most liberal phase, there really were a lot of these countries that came under British rule, but they stayed under British rule for many decades. And of course, the most obvious and important example here is the case of India, which was under British rule really from the mid-18th century right up until 1947 for nearly 200 years. Now, that is an important distinction, because I think if one contemplates American policy today, the time frame is a long way short of 200 years. Nation building is supposed to be done in roughly 24 months, as far as I can see. And I think the most important lesson that my book draws from the British experience is that that's not realistic.
And what were the British contributions to world order as you see it?
Well, I think there are two things really that cry out to be emphasized. The first is that by creating a kind of military dominance, particularly a naval dominance, this of course was the era before air power, and it was the sea that really mattered, the British did create a period of relative global peace. Lots of small wars, but very few big ones between the Crimea and 1914. So there's a kind of, if you like, a global order within which economic development is unquestionably more easy, in which free trade and international capital movements are a great deal less subject to disruption than they had been in previous ages, which had been punctuated by big great power wars. Now, that brings me to the second thing that one would want to emphasize, and in some ways it's a rather technical economic point, and that is the extraordinary way in which international investment, cross-border investment, spread out all over the world including to relatively, indeed in some cases, very poor countries. Now, globalization 100 years ago was different in this respect from globalization today, because most capital flows today are within the developed world. They go from North America to Europe to East Asia, and whole areas of the world have no, if you like, contact with globalization. That's the real reason they're poor. It's not globalization that makes them poor, it's the fact that they're not involved in it. Whereas 100 years ago, because the British Empire governed a great many poor countries, investors were prepared to put their money at relatively low interest rates into, to give just one obvious example, a country like Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, and now as a result of disastrous independent government tyranny of Robert Mugabe, now one of the great economic basket cases of sub-Saharan Africa. But 100 years ago, somewhere where you would actually quite willingly invest your money if you were a London capitalist. So it's a combination of global security and a relatively even distribution of capital, which I argue, and this is perhaps the most controversial argument of all, was on balance good, not just for the British economy, but for the world economy.
Now, in distinguishing the British Empire from America's global power today, you also emphasize the fact that the flow of both people and capital was out, so to speak, to the provinces, whereas that's not the case with the United States today, that people are coming to the United States and the U.S. is borrowing very heavily.
Yes, I think if one wants to understand the difference between British power a century ago and American power today, one would want to emphasize these, if you like, deficits, manpower deficits and capital or current account deficits. British power was based fundamentally on the export, not just of capital, but of people, as you just said. I mean, 20+ million people leave the British Isles in this great explosion of human migration. And that's why the British Empire trumps the French Empire. It's why it trumps the Dutch Empire. It's why it really trumps the Spanish Empire. No other European country has this kind of surplus manpower willing to go from very often the Celtic periphery to very remote, hot, dangerous countries and stay there and settle them. So the fact that the US today is not exporting people, in fact Americans are quite reluctant to go abroad even for relatively short business trips, as far as I can see, means that it doesn't have people on the ground in the way that the British Empire did. I mean, today there may be 3.5 million Americans who actually are resident abroad, and most of them live in either Canada, Mexico, or Western Europe, which aren't really the kind of key, if you like, fronts in the Great War against terror. There are hardly any Americans who live in the Middle East outside Israel, and hardly any live in sub-Saharan Africa. So it is an empire without settlers, today's American empire, and that necessarily makes it a less powerful empire.
Now you are, in your book, The Cash Nexus, were critical of the United States, I could say, and in fact, you basically, I think in your conclusion, fault the United States because, like the British in the 19th century, it had put these 4 dimensions that you had identified earlier in your discussion of the buildup of state power. It had put all that together in a way, but somehow was almost cowardly in, and that's my word, you had a word that was fairly strong, in assuming the responsibility that went with what that power allowed it to do, the responsibility. Talk a little about that.
Well, the book was written in the later Clinton years. It was a pre-9/11 book. And at that time, the thing that most preoccupied me, I had begun teaching in New York and was very struck by this, was the extent to which Americans regarded themselves as living on a more or less separate planet from the rest of us. I used to tease my students by calling it Planet NASDAQ, because it seemed really to be quite distinct from the rest of the world. Their preoccupations with the stock market, and indeed their preoccupations with American life, more or less excluded interest in, let us say, Rwanda. It had made it extremely difficult to interest Americans, although they ultimately did accept their responsibilities in the Balkans. So my anxiety in the late 1990s and going into 2000 was that here we had globalization, big time, extraordinary economic change going on in the world, integration of markets unseen in 100 years. But the dominant power in the world was not willing to underwrite this with any kind of political structures. It was, in a sense, allowing large parts of the world to descend into, at best, a kind of organized chaos. And I argued at the end of the book that what was most wrong with the world in the year 2000 was that we had globalization, but the world's superpower was talking about a missile defense shield, as if the future lay in retreating into some huge electronic tortoise shell. And I explicitly said in the last chapter of the book that what the US should be doing was to use its enormous material resources, its vast wealth, to increase its military capability and to get rid of rogue regimes, including, I specifically mentioned, Iraq. I also mentioned Milosevic's Serbia. I couldn't really have predicted that so swiftly, after the publication of the book, events would unfold that made those things happen. One of the other things I said in the book was that the US was kidding itself and that a major terrorist attack was quite likely to happen in an American city. So that happened within about 6 or 7 months of the book's publication in the US. And after that, as barely needs to be spelt out, everything changed. An administration which had narrowly been elected on an anti-interventionist, almost isolationist campaign became the most interventionist administration we've seen since the 1960s. So things which at the cash nexus seemed tremendously reckless and rash. I was pilloried by some American reviewers for suggesting that the US should engage in regime change against countries like Iraq. And now government policy. Quite surprising, really.
As a historian, what do you see as enduring qualities of the United States or characteristics that will deter it from assuming this new role, even though clearly the Bush administration has moved further along the path of assuming responsibility for global security?
I think there are two things I'd emphasize. One is the Republican Constitution. I mean, the US is designed not to produce emperors, it's designed to produce non-charismatic leaders as president, as Tocqueville pointed out. Americans always lament to me, particularly in university towns, that their president isn't a towering figure. And I say the whole idea of the Constitution is to keep towering figures out of the White House. What do you want? So part of the point is the Republican Constitution. It's not really designed to produce emperors and to run an empire. And I think it's very clear that what Congress tends to represent very accurately is the desire of a great many Americans, particularly those who don't live in the major policy-making cities, to keep out of nasty places like Iraq, to keep out of nasty places like Afghanistan. So point one, it's a constitutional issue. Republics only really become empires when they become empires. Now, the Roman case is, of course, very instructive here. It took about 400 years after the Republican Constitution was introduced in Rome for Caesar to cross the Rubicon and the Constitution to be changed. So we have a long way to go yet. We're about halfway, if you like, in American history from republic to empire. But the second point, I think, is that Americans think that they're an anti-imperialist society. They think that historically, since I suppose 1776, they've stood for resistance to empire. This is a very widely held theory. I guess it comes from high school history. It's absolute rubbish because, in fact, from the very outset, the United States behaved just like an empire, expanding over the entire North American continent and then beyond the shores of that continent. But I think partly since Vietnam, Americans have rewritten their own history to say, oh, we don't do empire. We never have done empire. And this is a mantra that all American politicians will incant, and it's something that's very widely believed. So part of the problem is the Constitution, but the other problem is almost a mental state. Americans are in denial about the fact that they are an empire. They just don't want to face that fact because it has too many bad associations with the great debacle of Vietnam.
And one of the symptoms of that is the notion that there cannot be one American life lost in an external intervention. We've moved away from that somewhat, but it is still a kind of a dominant thought about our behavior in the world, which may come back to haunt the president in Iraq as the casualties mount.
This is very striking to make this comparison. I've been working on this because the next book I want to to produce, which will be published next year, is about American empire. It'll be called Colossus. And I thought I would just look at this body count story because it's so clearly crucial. What's really striking is that it took around about 30 to 40,000 killed in action in Vietnam to cause public approval of the war to fall by 20%. And that took about 3 years. We've seen a 20% drop plus in approval for the war in Iraq, and actually less than 400 American troops have been killed in Iraq, and only about 2/3 of them have been killed in action. So in fact, the Vietnam syndrome is worse, as far as I can see, in 2003 than it ever was in the mid-1960s. That is a serious problem for a would-be empire. It's very, very hard to make a success of an undertaking like the one the US embarked on in Iraq this year if the public regards even 350 American service personnel dead as being an excessive price in a time frame as short as 6 months. I mean, the fantastically unrealistic expectations that seem to me to lie behind this public reaction are a big, big problem. And it does make me very pessimistic because it seems to me to make a premature withdrawal of the US from Iraq almost inevitable.
Now, you're suggesting in a new article in the National Interest that another Achilles heel is back to debt and the U.S. inability to do something about the debt that it's growing. And here you're saying it's not that wars cost a lot, or Paul Kennedy wasn't right that we would be stretched too far by military expenditures. That has been totally disproved. But it's really handling the domestic fiscal budget and the debt owed to retirees, to citizens for medical coverage and so on, is just sort of creating a level of fiscal irresponsibility that could lead to disaster.
It's extraordinary that if you go back to the 1980s, Paul Kennedy was arguing that the imperial overstretch would overtake the US. But in truth, America's overseas military commitments have been getting cheaper and cheaper. And you still have a defense budget which is roughly half in relation to gross domestic product what it was in the Cold War. And the cost of the entire reconstruction budget that the president has requested for Iraq and Afghanistan is 0.8% of US GDP. I mean, it's not big money. Although headline writers in the New York Times would love you to believe that this was the end of American solvency. These are not the problems. It's really actually red ink that's mounting up in the American welfare state that spells what I would call a kind of overstretch at home in the coming years. As the so-called baby boomer generation retires, the system of Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid is going to be stretched very, very severely. And there's some very, very interesting calculations being done by American economists, including my co-author, Larry Kotlikoff at Boston University, that show a widening, a really rather terrifyingly large gap between the revenues of the federal government and its projected expenditures. And these numbers dwarf the cost of nation building in Iraq. And we're talking about a long-term gap between expenditure and revenue of $45 trillion. And none of that has to do with well, virtually none of that has to do with nation building. Nearly all of it has to do with domestic welfare programs.
So look, we started on this intellectual odyssey in Glasgow with Tolstoy. We went into history, but now we've really come to policy. So I guess the final question is, what can history contribute to the policy debate that we have today?
A lot. I mean, one of the things that's most striking about coming to the United States is the relative lack of historical awareness among policymakers. Decisions are based on a very small amount of American history. There is virtually no reference to the history of any other country. Now, you would have thought, perhaps, at least I thought, that if you're in the business of invading Iraq, it might be worth taking a look at the previous attempts to invade and transform the institutions of Iraq. And we've, in fact, I say we, I mean the British have invaded Iraq 3 times in the last 100 years. And we undertook a very radical attempt to overhaul its institutions after the First World World War. I find no discussion. I found when I came to New York at the beginning of the war, no discussion of this issue whatsoever. All one gets is a caricature version of recent American history that goes something like this: Vietnam was terrible, we mustn't do that again. And that's it. Some people say we mustn't do it again by never intervening in another foreign country, and other people say we must not do it again, we must make sure that when we intervene, we do it right. And it's a tremendously unsophisticated debate. If America's in the business of empire, and I think it is, whatever name you give to this policy, then you have to learn from the history of other empires. It's simply not possible to talk any longer in terms of American exceptionalism and to pretend that comparative history is something for the Europeans to do. Americans need to realize that what they're doing has a long, long history. And the idea of transforming Mesopotamia institutionally and politically is not something that was dreamt up in the White House in the 1990s by Cheney and Rumsfeld. It's something that has deep, deep historical antecedents. So although my interest is history, and I see policy as something really for policymakers, my principal interest, and it's become much more powerful since I've been in the States, has been to make policymakers aware of the historical dimensions of the problems that they face.
Mm-hmm. And how, finally, for the final question, how would you advise students to prepare for the future, where clearly America is going to have this important role, is going to be, well, I guess a reluctant empire? How should they prepare or think about preparing?
Well, when students, particularly undergraduates, come to me and say, well, what should I be doing? One important piece of advice I give them is to think about what languages they should learn, because powerful though the English language is, there will never be a time when the whole world speaks one language. There will never be a time when there is only one empire. In a sense, the future of not only of the world but of historical study is a future in which the weight of Asia grows. And perhaps the relative weight of Europe declines. Now, back in the 1980s, when I was a student, I took a decision to learn German, because Germany still seemed to be a big deal. Sitting in Oxford, trying to work out what to research. Learning German and living in Germany and studying German history seemed like an extremely shrewd strategic move, and I don't think it was a bad move. But now, I wouldn't advise a student to do that. I say there's a choice. You can learn Chinese, or you can learn Arabic, but you have to choose one. And perhaps one day I'll have a student so brilliant that they can do both. But these are much more difficult languages than German. So it's a more difficult world we inhabit today. But the most important thing, particularly for American students, is to recognize that it isn't a unipolar world. It was never going to be. And the most important thing for a successful empire is to understand the other empires.
Neil, on that note, I'll thank you very much for joining us today for this fascinating conversation about your intellectual odyssey. Thank you.
Thank you, Gary.
And thank you very much for joining us for this conversation with history.